Yes, hello. Thanks for the invite, firstly. I really wish I could have come up. Liverpool is my favourite city in the world. I lived there. My family's from there. I'm an Everton fan. I really wish I had the opportunity to come up and spend a few days and visit some friends and stuff, but maybe next time. But so thanks very much for the invite. I appreciate it. I always feel bad when I talk about this book a little bit in that it's a very in some sense it's quite a depressing topic. So do strap in for the next five or so minutes, and I hope it's not too bad. But essentially, the book is called Drums in the Distance: Journeys into the Global Far Right, and the book is essentially an overview of in some ways the history of the rise of the far right around the world in the last three or so decades. And to tell that story, I actually work for an anti-fascist in the UK called Hope Not Hate, and our job is to monitor the far right and attempt to disrupt the far right. And one of the ways we do that is through infiltrating the side organizations and groups. And so the book tells the story of this rise of the far right, but it also tells the story of about a decade or so of infiltrations that I've done both within the UK, across Europe, and also some time I spent in America as well, which I can kind of come on to. But broadly speaking, the book is about where we are and how we got here when it comes to the far right. And when I was writing this a year or so ago, I started my kind of activism and research on this in 2010, and back then it would have been inconceivable that a decade later, roughly about 1,971,000,000 people would live in countries that were run by radical right governments around the world. And by that I mean, of course, at the time it was the United States with Donald Trump. We have Brazil under President Bolsonaro. We have India under President Modi. But also, if we look at, we have law and justice in Poland. We have Hungary ruled by Viktor Orban and Fidesz. But there's also not just the countries that are the main party or the president. We have far-right groupings and radical right groupings in parliamentary chambers across the continent of Europe. So Bulgaria, Estonia, Italy, Slovenia. And elsewhere, of course, we have radical right parties that are performing very well, or in certain cases in regional governments, etc. We have the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. We have the Austrian Freedom Party. We have Alternative for Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany in Germany. The Danish People's Party, Vox in Spain, the Finns in Finland. I could keep going on. Broadly speaking, one of the arguments in the book is that the electoral far right in recent decades has risen. Now, this rise has, of course, been uneven. I don't want to be alarmist and say that it's everywhere simultaneously, but we are seeing similar phenomenon happening simultaneously around the world. And one of the things the book tries to warn against is how normal this is becoming. I think if you look just back a couple of days ago, we had the German elections, and the AfD, this is a party that has become increasingly radical and increasingly far right in recent years, as there's been various splits. They in the election, right, which in some ways, of course, is very good when they were second back during their 2017 breakthrough, and they had 10.3% of the vote. Now, there was lots of newspaper articles going, oh, thank God the AfD have come fifth. But I think actually that's telling how normal that was, in the sense that 10.3% of the vote in Germany went to a far right party. Something that I think 2 decades ago would, in Germany's case, would have been inconceivable. And what we've seen is each country that was essentially deemed to be an exception is slowly but surely falling. So whether or not it's Germany would never have the return of the far right after its history of Nazism. Sweden is this liberal utopia. The Sweden Democrats are knocking on the door across there. Recently, another one again, we've seen the rise of the Portuguese far right. So a section of the book talks about these things, and it's broken into Europe, India, and Brazil. And it was interesting, climate change being mentioned. That's a big theme that runs through the back end of the book, because, of course, Bolsonaro in Brazil, a huge amount of these parties are either denying climate change, or they're actively or stopping effective change to deal with climate change. But there's also another side to the rise of the global far right, which I call the post-organizational far right, which is just a kind of annoying way of essentially saying what we've also seen alongside these traditional far right parties is a rise of a new form of far right activism in the digital age based on the internet. And what we've seen here is the emergence of new international, transnational far right groupings. And this involves often thousands of individuals all over the world offering micro donations of time, money, effort, and they collaborate together towards common goals. They're so often outside of any formal organization. There is no leader, there is no kind of structures. There are no you don't become a member. They organize together in various online spaces, on social media platforms, and they come together for periods and they campaign around things. And there is no formal structures here. What there are is these figureheads, these individuals that create content, YouTubers, those sorts of people within the far right that give this a sort of direction. And in some ways, this has changed the nature of certain types of far right activism. If you think back to things like the National Front or even the British National Party after them, getting active essentially required joining a party, canvassing, knocking on doors, handing out leaflets, selling newspapers on the street corner. Those sorts of forms of activism, at least turning out. And in some ways, there was a high risk of being found out because you would be on the street selling a newspaper. Your employer might find out, your neighbors might know, your family might find out. But now, of course, far-right activism can happen from the comfort of you anonymously, and you can do it anywhere in the world. You can have someone sat in Australia sending anti-Semitic hatred to a parliamentarian and the kind of the bar for entry into that activism is much lower, and as is the amount of social cost that can come with that activism. And sometimes these groups come together for short periods and collaborate on a thing. And I always remember back to Le Pen in France, one of her presidential elections a few years ago. She even released a video thanking what she called the online militants all over the world that helped her campaign. Not just the local activists in her branches around France, but all over the world, people creating content in French to French audiences and sharing it on social media platforms. And the other thing that the internet has changed in this, which I talk about in the book, is it means that the far right can crowdsource its anger from all over the world. In some ways, you might have a local far right group in Liverpool is really, really angry about halal chicken nuggets being sold or given out at a primary school in somewhere in Liverpool. And they're still angry about that, right? But then they're also angry about the fact that there's a school in Warsaw and that it's happening at a prison in Madrid. And the internet allows them to find all of these disparate events and bring them together and create this sense of this global crisis. And what this has meant is, as well as these traditional far-right groupings that I mentioned, the Sweden Democrats, Front National, and all of those parts of the Republican Party, if you will, we have these new movements that are emerging out of the internet. And I talk about this at length in the book, things like the alt-right, but there's anti-Muslim networks, etc. And these groups conceptualize the problem they're facing in a European sense or in a global sense, and they collaborate together. One of the most dangerous elements that has come out of this kind of post-organizational ways of far-right terrorism. When I started doing activism and research on this, say a decade or so ago, to get my friends and family would say, it was very nice, very earnestly, like pat you on the back. Oh, that's really interesting, but shouldn't you be doing something else? Shouldn't you be doing Islamic extremism? Was always the question. And we do a lot of stuff on Islamic extremism as well at Hope No Hate. But the idea was that essentially the far right is a bunch of kind of elderly people in duffel coats in pubs being racist. And that's what the far right looked like. Now, of course, that's not what anyone thinks anymore. Even in terms of the way it was policing, the security services didn't look at the far right. It was dealt with as a public order issue by the police. Now, of course, the far right is once again in the hands of the security services because it's understood to be a real danger. And we've seen this wave of terror attacks, right? We saw Anders Breivik back in 2011 in Norway that killed 69 people. We saw Dylan Roof in America in 2015, again, who shot 9 African Americans. We've seen in 2018 and 19 the shootings in Pittsburgh and Poway, both at synagogues, again, killing a number of people. In America that killed 22 more. We saw the MP, Joe Cox, of course, I'm sure you'll all remember, was murdered on the streets of Britain. And we also saw an attack in Finsbury Park in London where a far-right activist drove a van into a crowd of people coming out of a mosque in 2017. And then, of course, most recently, we've seen Halle in Germany, and there's lots of others I could go on, but there was the Christchurch attack, which I'm sure many of you will remember happened in March 2019. It killed 51 people and injured a further 49. And I think it's worth looking at that attack just briefly because I think it teases out a little bit what I mean by this global far right. So if you look at that specific attack, the killer was an Australian, but he was inspired by the actions of the British terrorist Darren Osborne. He talked about being inspired by the Swedish school murderer Anton Lundin. He talked about being inspired by Dylan Roof in America, and of course, way. I certainly wouldn't recommend it, but if you ever have to read his manifesto, he says that his ideology is derived from Oswald the fascist, the British fascist from the 1930s. He also talks about using the American slogan, the 14 words, we must protect our white children, etc., kind of bringing through American influences. He touches on historical reference points in that manifesto that are from the international anti-Muslim movement, the so-called counter-jihad movement. And also he talks about European identitarianism. These are all things that I don't need to get into in great length, but he's picking his ideas from around the global far right. Before his actual attack, he spent time in France, Croatia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Turkey, Bosnia, Herzegovina, again, all of which influenced his politics in various different ways. And if you look at the victims on that day, most importantly, of course, alongside New Zealand were migrants and refugees from Pakistan, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. What I mean by going into all this detail on this is the Christchurch killer was an individual. It was one person perpetrating an attack, but it came out of global networks of hatred, discrimination, and activism, and it affected a global community. And so part of the core argument of the book is that while of course we need to still continue to look at how the politics of discrimination and prejudice and hatred play out on our own streets, in our own towns, in our own communities, and of course in our own countries, to really understand a lot of what's happening right now, we have to think beyond that. Right? We have to think beyond just our country. We have to think across our continent. We have to think globally in some senses, and we have to think beyond just organizations, political parties, and we have to think about how the internet is changing these phenomena. And so that's the kind of overview of the book, which I know is depressing. I try to keep it a bit lighthearted. And the book actually also traces, I joined this organization, Hope Not Hate, in 2010, and it's an anti-terrorist organization, and we were campaigning against the British National Party, which at the time was the most successful electoral far-right party in British history. And in 2010, they lost. There was this huge campaign from all over the country, standing up local communities. And Hope Not Hate's mission is to both research and understand the far right, but also to go and spend time in the communities that are affected by this prejudice and try and deal with some of the material issues that these communities face. And I spent some time on that. And then the book kind of traces that activism through. I then started doing undercover work at Hope Not Hate. So I started to join, spent time in groups like the British National Party and various kind of more extreme fascist groups in the UK. Then there was kind of an upsurge of lots of street activism. So from about 2010, 2013, I spent lots of time on far-right demonstrations in and around the country. And then also in anti-Muslim demonstrations, again, these groups spread around the continent. I spent times with them. And then we start to see the rise of Donald Trump. We start to see all eyes moved. And I spent about various things over about 6-9 months. I spent about a year or 15 months in the Ku Klux Klan. And I set up a kind of a fake European branch of the Ku Klux Klan and then infiltrated through there. I joined a militia group in Alabama and went down to the desert, the Mexican border, so there's the American-Mexican border, and I spent time with this militia group there. And what's really interesting about that story, and there's lots of interesting bits about it, but well, I think there is anyway. Maybe if you've read it, you wouldn't agree. But what was really interesting there is one of the key things I tried to get through in the book is the politics is really dangerous. Right? It's very violent, and lots of the people are doing and believing things I think are really bad. But they are not monsters, right? They are human beings. And one of the key things that comes from spending time with these groups is understanding that this is normal people doing this and they are very bad. And the Alabama group was a great example. I spent time at their homes, met their families, I stayed at their houses. I went to the desert on this. These are guys with like handlebar mustaches called Bama, dressed up to the nines in camouflage gear and these huge semi-automatic rifles. And they were the nicest people you've ever met. And they were adorable. They couldn't have been kinder to me. They were friendly, they were nice, they were accommodating. All the stuff about Southern hospitality was true. But when we then drive to a petrol station or gas station, I'm looking at some sweets on the side of like one of the shelves, and I'm picking it, and one of them just leans in and goes, by the way, when the race war comes, I've got a list of mosques I'm going to shoot. And it's that stark thing about good people that you think are normal people are doing these terrible things. And I think that's a useful thing to kind of finish on and remember, in that if we turn around and make this abstract and say that we are nice, normal people and there's outside doing these terrible things, we're never going to be able to understand how those people end up doing these things and how we can bring them back from the precipice and engage with them. And it involves understanding that they are human beings like us, normal people, but they are just engaged in very bad and extreme behavior. It's not about excusing it. We've got to oppose it in all its forms, but we have to remember that they are human beings as well. So that's the kind of rapid overview of the book. And there's some stuff in India, and unfortunately, because of COVID, I didn't get to Brazil. But there is, that's a brief overview of the key arguments, if you will, and a few of the little stories.